Okay, welcome to the first week's lecture. We're using this book for the first week. We are going to switch over to the other book after a while. I mentioned that I don't normally use PowerPoint presentations, so there's not really going to be much going on the screen over there while we're doing the lecture, so you just have to kind of pay attention and take notes. Okay, let's begin. So, page 1 in the book. Chapter 1, where to start. So, they talk about this book, which is pretty decent. They talk about, what's it for? And it talks about, a review of the major administration systems and a quick reference guide and focusing on server and technical kind of things like network kind of administration. Now, the use of this book is actually pretty good. It's not really a textbook. It's just a normal book you buy at the bookstore. It's a very good thing to have on the shelf. If you ever become a UNIX system administrator, you probably want this book. I mean, it's a good reference book to I forgot how to install a printer. Let me go flip through there. Oh, I forgot how to, that kind of stuff. It's actually a pretty decent book. That's kind of why I chose it. The only problem, let's keep going. So on page 4, they talk about the duties of the system administrator. And these are straightforward things that you've heard of before, right? Nothing's controlling access. Yeah, that's a big thing. That and security, right? Most people are going to if you have a Linux server in your business, you're going to be spending an awful lot of time on security and controlling access. Adding hardware, yeah. You got that new printer or the new hard drive. Automating tasks. You don't want to have a bunch of tedious tasks that you have to perform all over and over again, so you would script them so it makes it easier to do. We're not doing that much programming in this course, a tiny bit of programming. Overseeing backups, we're going to fake that, but we are going to do it, but we're going to fake it. Installing and upgrading software, you bet, that's big business, particularly with software patches and how often do you go get patches, things of that nature. Plus, there's other chapters in here about, monitoring performance and doing troubleshooting and documenting your system and tuning performance and policies and all sorts of other things, to include an entire chapter on what's called firefighting, which means something has gone wrong. Either you're under attack or a piece of hardware has failed and now you have to deal with it as a system administrator. On page 7, they talk about the suggested background. Now, unfortunately, it says right here in the book that we're assuming that you've been doing Unix command line stuff for quite some time before you decided to pick this book up. Now, don't panic, because that's not what I'm going to be doing. I'm assuming that you never even heard of Unix or Linux before in your entire life. That's why we have 2 books. So after this first introductory chapter in the big book, we're going to stop, switch over to the command line, and get all that command line stuff that we need. So the first third of the course is going to be command line, and then with the other 2/3 is going to be the administration piece. So that's why we have 2 books, because this one assumes that you've already done all that stuff. You already know how to copy a file. You already know how to rename a directory, that kind of stuff. So I'm not making that assumption. Now, part of the problem is a lot of people have just never spent any time at the command prompt ever. I mean, if you're an old fart like me, and you grew up in the DOS days, well, of course you know how to operate the command prompt and copy a file and delete things and rename things. But a lot of people have never had that experience, and so it could be a rude awakening. Now, let me give you a story. It's not exactly associated with Linux, but it's still a good story nevertheless. Microsoft Windows has this thing called Server Core. It's a cut-down version of Windows Server that's only designed to do 1 or 2 small things. Its design and architecture is very similar to the way we're going to be doing our Linux server. So all it has is a command line. Okay, so I said, hey, I'm going to try that. And so I thought, what the heck, I got a spare machine. I'll just install it on my spare machine. And so I installed the whole thing. And then it came up to the point where, okay, I have to rename my machine. And I go, well, I've never done that from the command line before. I have no idea how to do that. So I switched over to Google. Went, oh, okay, good. Oh, wait, I need to change the IP address of my machine. I've never done that from the command line before. So I switched back over to Google. And this went on and on and on. I mean, I didn't have any idea at all how to operate Windows Server core from the command line. I was a babe in the woods. Had to hit Google every single time I had to do something. It was a rude awakening. And I'm afraid that some of you guys are going to have the exact same awakening. It's going to be, you want me to do what at the command line? So, yeah, that's kind of sort of what we're after. Oddly enough, an awful lot of the administrative tasks in Linux are not done on the GUI. They're almost all done from the command line. Yeah, that's, I mean, you want to pause a printer or you know, that kind of stuff, you're probably going to be doing it the command line. I mean, there are other things. I mean, you have shell scripts and you have Ruby and, you know, Python. I mean, there's all sorts of other things you can do. I mean, some have web interfaces, but an awful lot of the time we're going to be spinning at the command prompt. On page 8, they talk about the Linux distributions. We abbreviate that by calling it a distro, a Unix distro. And a distribution is basically how you take the Linux core from the maintainers of the operating system, plus a whole bunch of utilities manufactured by another organization called the GNU project. And so the copy command in Linux is a free and open source version of copy that's modeled after the actual command in Unix. Now, it's not using the same source code, but all the command line switches, and it absolutely operates exactly the same. It's just they weren't built upon the same core. So a Linux distribution is the Linux kernel, all of the utilities, and then whatever the heck else you want to put in there. Now, there's a gazillion of these things out there. Even you could make a Linux distro. You could go in there and say, I'm going to build me, you know, a Linux distribution. So you just go grab the parts you want and put this thing together. Now, the fact that it's so easy to do kind of lends to a problem that there are a gazillion distributions out there. It's unbelievable. So let's go take a peek. How do you pick one? Okay. So do you pick a Linux distribution because it's popular? That might actually be good. Good if an awful lot of people are running it. That means there's going to be an awful lot of extra software and other features and help. Like when you go to the internet and ask for help, that everyone will know what you're talking about. So maybe it's by features. I mean, there's a specialized version of a distro called Kali, and it's used by the super spooks, you know, to go in and do all sorts of security penetration testing and things. You know, very, very specialized. And then, of course, you have the choice about those companies that really want a support tail. I mean, you and I, downloading free software sounds fantastic, right? But in a business environment, they probably don't like the idea that there's no liability chain. There's no one to go back to and say, hey, this didn't work, I need your help. So there are companies out there that sell a Linux distribution. Now, technically, a company like Red Hat isn't selling the operating system because it's free and open source, and that would be against the rules. But what it is that they're selling is the support. So you're paying a fee to have somebody at the other end of the phone or tech support to be able to solve your problems. So on page 9, table 1-1, we've got this list of distributions. I mean, there's a bunch. We happen to be using one called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a branch of what's called Debian. Again, don't worry about what all this means. Debian is the name of the wife of the guy who put together that particular one. Anyway, bottom line is there's a bunch of these things, and you just kind of pick which one you want. Mint, for example, is the one that's probably the closest to Windows. So if you wanted to get a distro where you could just kind of close your eyes and everything looks almost exactly the same as Windows, you'd probably go for Mint, okay, as an example. Okay, we're using Ubuntu, and we're going to be installing the server version with no GUI support whatsoever. Later on, we're going to be installing the workstation support, which comes with tons and tons of GUI support, but that'll be much, much later in the course. Okay, so one of the things we're going to be using 1804 LTS. That's the flavor of Ubuntu that we're using. LTS stands for long-term service, which means it's instead of having the Linux distribution change very, very rapidly with new things coming and going, these things are like annual setups. So there'll probably be another one in a couple of years that'll replace the LTS one. So the LTS one is designed to be stable, very slow moving, very only like patches that are security related, not big changes. So the LTS versions are almost always a year or so behind, but that's not really a big deal. Okay, so wait a minute. Let's just back up a bit. So what's Unix and what's Linux? Okay, so a history lesson. Unix was written by AT&T Bell Labs way back when. Back in the day before the divestiture of AT&T, they were very, very free with a bunch of their stuff. And so basically they just started kind of giving away to things. And so they gave away a chunk of it. And so the University of California at Berkeley kind of said, hey, we're going to take yours and we're going to do some other stuff with it. So they created the Berkeley Standard Distribution, BSD. And so for a while, there was two versions of Unix. There was the original AT&T System 5, and then the BSD version. And so there was some competition between the two, and things kind of the two kind of separated, so to speak, on the natural progression, the tree, so to speak. And then the U.S. government stepped in and said, we don't really like the fact that there's two of these things. So we're going to come up with a POSIX standard, P-O-S-I-X, a POSIX standard that says, here's what we mean when we buy Unix. And it brought all the vendors together because it specified exactly how all the system calls had to be made. And oddly enough, what that did is it became a blueprint for other people to come along and create their own Unix-like operating systems, because the POSIX standard is a blueprint. It says, this function call has to be called this, it has to have this parameter, and it has to have this, it has to have that. I mean, it was a perfect blueprint. Okay, so this is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark, and we'll pick this thing up again in just a few.